The German officer stood at the edge of the baseball field, watching American guards laugh with Italian prisoners over a dropped fly ball, and felt something close to panic rising in his chest. This was not imprisonment. This could not be what defeat looked like. He had been trained to expect many things when captured: interrogation, hard labor, meager rations, the cold efficiency of a system designed to break men down to their essential parts. But no one had prepared him for this. The absence of walls, the casual conversations, the way prisoners walked freely between barracks as if they were simply visiting another town. The contradiction was so complete, so total, that it felt like a trap. And yet, it was no trap. It was simply America, conducting war even in captivity according to principles that made no sense to men raised under different stars. The freedom of movement in these camps would become the thing that haunted them most, not because it was cruel, but because it was kind in ways that unraveled everything they thought they knew about power, about strength, about what it meant to hold dominion over defeated men. The trains carrying Axis prisoners across the American heartland in 1943 and 1944 moved through landscapes that seemed impossible. Carl Fisher pressed his face against the window somewhere in Kansas and saw farmland stretching to a horizon unmarked by craters, towns with lit windows, bridges that still stood. He had left behind a Europe carved into trenches and graves, cities reduced to broken teeth against burning skies. The prisoner beside him, a young Italian named Antonio Rossini, kept whispering the same phrase over and over: La terra è intatta, the land is untouched. They had expected camps in ruins, a nation bled dry by war effort. Instead, they saw abundance that felt obscene. Factories with all their windows intact, children playing in streets that had never known the whistle of falling bombs. The trains stopped at small stations where local people stood and stared, some with hatred in their eyes, yes, but most with simple curiosity, as if the prisoners were exotic animals rather than enemies who had killed their sons. The distance between the Europe they had left and the America they were entering was not measured in miles, but in the complete absence of destruction. The camps themselves appeared first as absences: no high concrete walls, no watchtowers bristling with machine guns, no dead zones of bare earth surrounding electrified fences. Camp Concordia in Kansas, Camp Ruston in Louisiana, Camp Florence in Arizona. These places announced themselves with simple wire fencing that seemed almost decorative, with wooden barracks that looked like summer camps, with grounds that included trees left standing for shade. The Italian prisoners especially could not reconcile what they saw with what they knew of prisoner camps. Many had seen photographs of concentration camps, had heard whispers of what happened in the East. Some of the Germans carried their own shame about such places, though they would not speak of it yet. When the trucks rolled through the gates of Camp Hernon, Texas on a blazing afternoon in July 1943, Antonio Rossini found himself assigned to a barracks that had screened windows, electric lights, and individual cots with actual mattresses. The American sergeant who processed his group spoke in broken Italian, apologized for the heat, and told them there would be swimming privileges on Wednesday afternoons. Swimming privileges. Antonio stood holding his assigned blanket and tried to understand what kind of war allowed defeated soldiers to swim. It was not the infrastructure that shocked them first, but the movement. Within the first week, Carl Fisher realized that prisoners walked to the mess hall without guards. They walked to the recreation field alone. They moved between their barracks and the library and the canteen as if the wire fence was merely a suggestion rather than a boundary enforced by rifles. The American guards seemed almost bored, smoking cigarettes and reading magazines while hundreds of enemy soldiers wandered the compound with a freedom that would have been unthinkable in any European camp. He watched a group of Italian prisoners organize a soccer game without asking permission. He saw men gather under trees to play cards, to write letters, to simply sit in conversation as the evening cooled. The guards did not rush over to break up gatherings. They did not demand to know what was being discussed. They simply watched from a distance, present but not oppressive, maintaining order without the constant demonstration of force that Carl had assumed was essential to keeping prisoners subdued. The cognitive dissonance was profound. These men had been raised in systems where control meant visibility, where power was demonstrated through the constant presence of authority. The Nazi regime had taught that strength showed itself in rigid order, in the precise spacing of formations, in the inability of subordinates to move without explicit permission. Italian fascism had emphasized similar hierarchies, the glory of the state made manifest through control of individual movement. And now here they were, defeated enemies in the hands of a nation that seemed to have forgotten how imprisonment was supposed to work. Karl began walking the perimeter in those early weeks, trying to understand the boundaries of this strange captivity. The fence was real enough, wire mesh perhaps 10 feet high, simple and utilitarian, but there was only one guard tower for every several hundred yards, and the guards inside them often read books or chatted with each other rather than maintaining constant surveillance. The space between the fence and the barracks was not empty killing ground, but grass where prisoners sat and talked. Some men had started small gardens near their buildings, planting vegetables in the Texas soil with seeds provided by the camp administration. The freedom extended even to the hours of darkness. There was a curfew, yes, but it meant being inside your barracks, not being locked inside your barracks. The buildings themselves remained unlocked. Men could move between bunks, could gather in the common areas, could use the latrines without requesting permission or being accompanied by guards. The first time Antonio woke in the middle of the night and walked to the bathroom alone, passing through shadows without challenge, he felt the absence of surveillance like a physical thing. In the Italian army, even free soldiers had faced more restriction than this. The days developed rhythms that felt less like imprisonment and more like a strange military assignment in a place where the war had forgotten to arrive. Morning roll call was casual, almost perfunctory. Work details were organized for those who volunteered, and they were actually volunteers, with men allowed to refuse without punishment. The Americans were desperate for labor in their agricultural heartland, with so many farmhands fighting overseas, but they followed Geneva Convention protocols with a literalism that baffled men from nations where such rules were treated as suggestions. Karl found himself assigned to a cotton-picking detail at a nearby farm because he had raised his hand when they asked for workers. He was paid 80 cents a day in camp scrip. Not much, but payment nonetheless, for labor he could have declined. The farmer who owned the land, an old man with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes, brought them water during breaks and spoke to them like hired hands rather than enemies. His son was fighting in Italy, he told them through a translator. He hoped someone was treating his boy decent over there. The psychology of it was corrosive in ways that barbed wire never could be. It would have been easier to maintain hatred, to preserve the clear lines of us and them, if the Americans had been cruel. Karl found himself thinking this often, found himself almost wishing for harshness because at least that would have made sense. Instead, there was this persistent decency that made him question things he had been certain about. If Americans were weak and mongrelized and corrupted by democracy as he had been taught, why did they seem so casually confident? Why did they treat defeated enemies with a generosity that suggested they could afford to be kind? The Italians adapted faster, perhaps because their faith in fascism had already been cracking before capture. Antonio wrote letters home to his mother in Naples, letters that were read by censors but not heavily redacted, describing the food, the space, the way guards would sometimes share cigarettes and joke with prisoners who spoke English. He tried to explain the freedom of movement, but could not find words that would make it believable. How could he describe walking unescorted to the camp theater to watch American movies? How could he convey the strangeness of being allowed to gather in groups of any size without suspicion? The camp canteen became a focal point of the freedom they could not quite process. Men could walk there at designated hours and purchase items with their work scrip: candy, cigarettes, toiletries, writing paper. The transaction itself was the thing that unsettled them. They walked up to a counter, requested items, paid, and left. No guards accompanied them. No one searched them afterward. The Americans seemed to trust that the prisoners would simply follow the rules because the rules existed, without the enforcement mechanisms that Karl had assumed were necessary for any system to function. There were attempts to escape, of course. Some men felt duty-bound to try. to maintain the fiction that they were still soldiers fighting a war rather than workers waiting out history's verdict. But even the escape attempts revealed the peculiar character of American imprisonment. The few Germans who made it beyond the fence usually turned themselves in within days, driven back not by pursuit but by the impossibility of disappearing in a landscape where they spoke no English, had no contacts, and stood out immediately as foreigners. One man made it 5 days before walking into a police station, sunburned and hungry, asking to be returned to camp where at least the food was regular and the beds were soft. The punishments for such attempts were so mild as to be almost insulting. A week in isolation, perhaps, in a cell that still had a window and regular meals. No beatings, no torture, no examples made to discourage others. The Americans seemed to view escape attempts as tedious inconveniences rather than profound violations requiring harsh response. Carl heard about a German officer who had tried to tunnel out of a camp in Arkansas and been caught, expecting execution or at least severe punishment, who instead was given 30 days of restricted privileges and assigned to dig latrines as extra duty. The man had seemed almost offended by the mildness of his sentence. Summer turned to fall and the freedom of movement continued to expand in small ways. Some camps began allowing supervised trips to nearby towns for prisoners who had proven trustworthy. Groups of Germans and Italians found themselves walking down Main Street in American small towns, eating ice cream under the eyes of a single guard who seemed more concerned with keeping them on schedule than preventing their escape. They saw American life up close, the abundance of goods in shop windows, the casual friendliness of civilians, the way people argued politics openly on street corners without fear of arrest. Antonio went on such a trip to a town near Camp Hearn and found himself in a diner, sitting at a counter eating a hamburger while the guard chatted with the waitress about her brother in the Pacific. The normalcy of it created a dissociation so profound he felt dizzy. He was an enemy soldier eating lunch in enemy territory, and the only thing that marked him as different was the PW stenciled on his jacket. The waitress refilled his coffee without comment, without hatred, treating him with the same tired courtesy she showed everyone. It was not the food that broke something open inside him, though the abundance of meat and bread and vegetables helped. It was not even the freedom of movement, though that remained the constant background hum of his confusion. It was the way the guard had to remind them to head back to the truck, had to tell them twice because they were absorbed in window shopping, and did so with exasperation rather than anger, like a parent dealing with distracted children. The casual authority was somehow more absolute than any show of force could have been. The internal conflicts these experiences created were not simple. Many prisoners, especially the Germans, clung to their ideologies even as the reality around them contradicted every principle. Carl found himself in bitter arguments with other officers who insisted that American kindness was weakness, that this demonstrated the racial inferiority they had been taught about, that a strong nation would never treat enemies with such softness. But even as they argued this, they accepted the food, enjoyed the freedom, took advantage of every privilege offered. The contradiction ate at them in quiet moments. There were men who became more Nazi in captivity than they had been in service, as if hardening their beliefs could protect them from the cognitive dissonance. They organized themselves into cells, enforced hierarchy and discipline among the prisoners, punished those who became too friendly with Americans. Several camps saw internal violence between hardliners and those who had begun to question, Germans attacking Germans in the darkness between barracks. The Americans struggled to understand these conflicts, could not quite grasp the psychological warfare being waged over the question of whether accepting kindness from enemies was a form of betrayal. But there were also men who felt something crack and fall away, felt the propaganda they had believed dissolve in the face of persistent evidence. Antonio was one of these. He had never been ideologically committed, had joined because all young men joined, had fought because his nation was fighting. Now he found himself wondering what he had been fighting for. Italy had changed sides already, was now fighting with the Allies, but the news felt distant and almost irrelevant. What mattered was the daily experience of being treated like a human being rather than a weapon or a threat. Winter came to the camps with its own adjustments. Heating was provided, adequate if not generous. Extra blankets were distributed. In the northern camps, prisoners were issued warmer clothing. The freedom of movement contracted slightly with the weather, fewer outdoor activities, less willingness to walk between buildings in freezing temperatures, but the fundamental openness remained. Men still gathered in recreation halls without guards present. They still organized their own activities, their own sports leagues, their own educational classes. Carl began attending English lessons taught by a fellow prisoner who had lived in America before the war. He told himself it was practical, that language skills would be useful whenever this ended. But there was something else drawing him a curiosity about these people who had defeated him and then declined to act like victors. The language lessons became discussions about American culture, about democracy and individual rights and concepts that had no direct German equivalent. The teacher, a man named Ernst who had worked in Chicago before being deported in 1940, spoke about America with a fondness that seemed like treason but felt like truth. The Americans celebrated Christmas with a generosity that felt calculated to unsettle. Special meals were prepared. Packages from the Red Cross were distributed. Guards wished prisoners sincere holiday greetings. Some camps allowed prisoners to hold religious services according to their own traditions, with Christian prisoners gathering to sing carols in German and Italian while guards stood respectfully at a distance. The humanity of it was almost unbearable. It would have been easier if the Americans had been monsters. Antonio found himself crying during midnight mass on Christmas Eve, overwhelmed by memories of home and the surreal gentleness of his captivity. He thought of his mother in Naples, wondering if she had enough to eat, if the city was still standing, if the war had finally rolled past and left her in peace. He thought of the guards outside the chapel, young men his own age who carried rifles but rarely pointed them, who seemed almost embarrassed by their role as jailers. He thought about the freedom he had to walk to this service, to worship, to gather with other men in the darkness and sing songs from childhood. The spring of 1944 brought news of Allied advances in Italy, of the grinding progress toward Germany itself. The end was becoming visible on the horizon, though the horizon was still distant. In the camps, this created a strange atmosphere, a sense of waiting, of existing in parenthesis between the violence they had left and the uncertain future ahead. The freedom of movement took on new meaning as men realized they might spend years in these camps, that this strange half-life might extend long past the war's conclusion. More work programs opened as American labor shortages intensified. Prisoners were transported daily to farms, to lumber camps, to food processing plants. They traveled in trucks with minimal guards, worked alongside civilian supervisors, and were generally treated like temporary employees rather than captive enemies. Carl found himself working in a canning factory in Texas, operating machinery alongside local women whose husbands and sons were overseas. The women brought extra food to share during breaks, asked him questions about Germany, showed him pictures of their boys in uniform. One woman, elderly and kind-faced, told him she hoped her grandson, fighting somewhere in France, was being treated as well as the Americans treated their prisoners. The comment landed like a blow. Carl thought of Russian prisoners on the Eastern Front, of the camps he had seen where Soviet soldiers were starved and worked to death. He thought of things he had witnessed and things he had tried not to see, and the shame was sudden and overwhelming. The freedom of movement the Americans had given him was not weakness. It was the privilege of a nation that had nothing to hide, no atrocities it needed to obscure behind walls and secrecy. This was perhaps the deepest cut, the realization that generous treatment of prisoners indicated confidence and strength rather than weakness. The Americans could afford to be kind because they were winning, because their homeland was untouched, because they had resources to spare and a philosophical commitment to rules even when those rules constrained them. They treated prisoners well not despite being strong, but because they were strong enough that kindness posed no threat. The cognitive work this required from men raised under fascism was immense. Everything in Carl's training had taught him that domination required the constant demonstration of power, that any relaxation of control was dangerous, that kindness to enemies was sentimentality that would be exploited. But here was empirical evidence that a system could be simultaneously humane and effective, that you could give men freedom of movement and still maintain order, that respecting international law did not make you weak. Some men never accepted this. They returned to Germany after the war still convinced of their ideological correctness, explaining away the American treatment as an anomaly or a trick. But others, and Karl was slowly becoming one of them, felt their entire worldview shifting like continental plates, grinding against each other and creating earthquakes in the landscape of belief. It was uncomfortable and disorienting and could not be undone. The war in Europe ended in the spring of 1945 with Germany's surrender. The news reached the camps in waves, first rumors, then confirmations, then the reality settling over everything like dust. The freedom of movement continued, unchanged by the war's conclusion. The Americans did not crack down or relax. They simply maintained the same steady approach they had shown all along. This consistency was itself meaningful. They had not been kind strategically, waiting for advantage. They had simply been following their own rules because the rules mattered to them. Repatriation would take time. Months, perhaps years for some. In the interim, the camps continued functioning as they had, strange villages where former enemies lived in casual comfort, waiting for history to decide what to do with them. Antonio planted a garden in the spring of 1946, growing tomatoes and basil in Texas soil, tending plants he would never harvest because his repatriation papers came through in July. The freedom to plant something, knowing you would not be there to enjoy it, this was perhaps the ultimate expression of the peculiar liberty they had been granted. Karl remained in the camp system until early 1947, part of the last wave of German prisoners finally deemed safe to return. He had spent nearly 4 years in American captivity, years that had unmade and remade him in ways he was still trying to understand. The freedom of movement had never ceased to feel strange. Even after thousands of days walking unescorted between barracks, after countless trips to the canteen and the library and the recreation field, he never quite lost the small jolt of surprise that no one stopped him, no one demanded papers, no one struck him for looking a guard in the eye. He tried to explain it in letters to his wife, being reunited with her in the ruins of what had been their city. She could not understand. How could she? She had lived through the bombing and the starvation and the Russian occupation. She had experienced the collapse of everything while he had been playing baseball in Texas, earning money picking cotton, watching American movies in a camp theater. The gap between their experiences was unbridgeable, and Karl found himself silent about most of it, unable to convey the psychological impact of being treated well by people he had been taught to despise. The freedom of movement in those camps became a secret carried by hundreds of thousands of men, a story they told in fragments or not at all. Some felt ashamed, as if accepting decent treatment had been a form of collaboration. Others felt anger, wondering why such standards had not been universal, why their own nation had not followed similar rules. Still others felt simply confused, unable to reconcile the America they had experienced with the America they had been told existed. Antonio returned to Naples still recovering from war, still scarred by occupation and battle. He found work slowly, rebuilt his life, married and had children. But he never stopped thinking about Texas, about the strangeness of that captivity. When his son asked him about the war, he struggled to find words. How do you explain being a prisoner who could walk freely? How do you convey the psychological complexity of being defeated and then treated with a dignity you had not extended to others? The story of these camps remained largely untold for decades, overshadowed by the greater narratives of the war, the battles and the bombings, the death camps and the heroism. The experience of Axis prisoners in America seemed almost trivial by comparison, almost embarrassing in its lack of suffering. But for the men who lived it, the freedom of movement was not trivial. It was the daily demonstration of a different way of understanding power, of relating to enemies, of conducting yourself even when no one was watching. It was not the barbed wire that contained them, but the recognition that they had been shown something better than they had shown others. It was not the guards that kept them from running, but the understanding that beyond the fence was a nation they had tried to destroy, that had responded with a restraint and humanity their own systems had lacked. The contradiction of it created a captivity more complete than any wall, a psychological containment born from the cognitive dissonance of being treated better than you deserved. The camps are gone now, converted back to farmland or developed into suburbs, their barracks dismantled and their fences torn down. The men who lived in them are mostly gone too, taking their complicated memories with them. But the question they embodied remains. What does it mean to be strong? Is strength demonstrated through domination or through the confidence to show restraint? Can a nation prove its power by being kind to those who cannot resist? The Axis prisoners, who could not believe the shocking freedom of movement in American camps, found themselves confronting these questions every day, with every walk to the mess hall, with every unguarded conversation, with every moment they were treated like men rather than threats. Some accepted the lesson, others rejected it. But none of them forgot it. The freedom to move had been more revolutionary than they could have imagined, not because it allowed them to go anywhere, but because it challenged everything they believed about where power comes from and how it should be used. And there were thousands more stories like this, waiting to be remembered.